Okay, I've been involved since 1974 in a range of groups and campaigns trying to encourage people to support one another and to make the world a better place. Such groups include ones promoting libertarian socialist politics, otherwise known as anarchism, workplace solidarity, in which at one time I was branch secretary of the Union of Post Office Workers, and later, incidentally, found to have been illegally added to the Consulting Association blacklist, the green section. So I support the blacklist support group, whose statement I believe is to follow soon. So I've been involved with groups promoting claimants' rights, environmental campaigning, including London Greenpeace, opposition to corporate power and exploitation, including being one of the two defendants in the McLibel case, which I'll come on to, the anti-poll tax movement, groups promoting community mutual aid and self-organisation to encourage people to speak up for their needs as local residents and the needs of their own neighbourhoods. I am currently secretary of the Haringey Federation of Residents Associations and chair of the National Federation of Parks and Green Spaces. So coming on to the most relevant groups for the inquiry, London Greenpeace and the McLibel campaign and the subversion of civil rights by the undercover policing units. First, London Greenpeace. I can refer to the opening statement of Matthew Ryder briefly, where he set out about London Greenpeace, so I won't repeat all of that. London Greenpeace was established in 1971, and it was the first Greenpeace group in Europe and one of the first 3 Greenpeace groups in the world, and it still exists today. Just while I'm on looking at Matthew Ryder's statement, can I just quote Bob Lambert, who's coming up in a minute in my statement. Bob Lambert explained his actions in the following way, quote, as part of my cover story, so as to gain the necessary credibility to become involved in serious crime, I first built a reputation as a committed member of London Greenpeace, a peaceful campaigning group. Both London Greenpeace and the McLibel support campaign were infiltrated by undercover police officers. Actually, we are concerned that there was an undercover police officer before Bob Lambert joined the group in the early mid-1980s. And as Matthew Ryder explained, that undercover officer, if existing, has not been made known. He goes on to say, it appears very likely the group was infiltrated since a report produced for the Cabinet Joint Intelligence Committee in 1980 called The Current Threat to the United Kingdom from Terrorism states, anti-nuclear power groups have been active since 1977 in arranging demonstrations in various parts of the country. In the past 2 years, there has been a marked increase in the number of small anarchist-dominated or influenced groups in the United Kingdom, the most prominent being London Greenpeace. The latter plays a major coordination role in anti-nuclear affairs and is responsible for many of the international links. Matthew Ryder carries on with the quote from that report. The bulk of the anti-nuclear power lobby, including most of the anarchist groups in the United Kingdom, is opposed to the use of violence, and there is no evidence of any current terrorist threat from that quarter. So that was certainly one of the major activities of London Greenpeace in the 1970s, was opposing nuclear weapons and nuclear power. To go back to my own statement, Bob Lambert, who infiltrated London Greenpeace, contributed significantly to the creation of the anti-McDonald's leaflet and campaign, which McDonald's sued over. This is a copy of the leaflet, which was produced by the group, and so on. He was later followed by John Dines, undercover officer, and later Matt Rayner, undercover officer, also was associated with the McLibel support campaign specifically, rather than London Greenpeace generally. In addition, between 1989 and 1991, there was infiltration by at least 7 spies hired by the McDonald's Corporation, one of whom had a 6-month relationship with someone in the group. Please see the detailed opening statement of my McLibel co-defendant, Helen Steel, which will follow soon, which I support and do not need to repeat here. In summary, the McLibel case ran from 1990 to 2005, encompassing the longest trial in English legal history. We were denied legal aid in a jury trial and therefore had to defend ourselves. My note 3 in my statement refers to the McLibel documentary, which was broadcast by the BBC, can be seen on YouTube. And we recommend that people look at a particular 10-minute extract from the 4th minute to the 14th or 15th minute, which includes reference to the fact sheets, McDonald's own infiltrators, some photographs, a video of a protest in 1989 outside McDonald's headquarters, in which a McDonald's spy was with leaflets, was standing next to John Dines, the undercover officer John Dines. And at that same protest, as evidence given in the McLibel case showed, McDonald's UK vice president testified that a special branch officer was given a perch, as he called it, next to himself at the headquarters to jointly observe that very protest in that film that you can see. And then there follows some further, within that time slot in the film, some footage of myself and my son on my bikes outside my home in Tottenham. And I've recently found out that undercover officer Matt Rayner had an abusive sexual relationship with a woman living next door to me, and so on. Finally, within that time frame within the film, it shows how we were denied a jury trial, denied legal aid, but we were offered pro bono legal advice by barrister Keir Starmer, who's now, of course, leader of the Labour Party. How much of that privileged advice was undercover officer John Dines privy to whilst living with Ms. Steel, my co-defendant throughout the case? However, as a result of our efforts as litigants in person, the High Court and then Court of Appeal ruled that McDonald's exploited children with their advertising, produced misleading advertising to the public, that McDonald's regular customers face an increased risk of heart disease, that McDonald's were culpably responsible for cruelty to animals, were antipathetic to unionisation, and it was fair comment to say McDonald's workers suffered poor pay and conditions. It emerged during the McLibel trial that police officers, including Special Branch, had passed private and in some cases false information about us and other protesters, including home addresses to McDonald's. Sid Nicholson, McDonald's head of security and vice president, was a former Met Chief Superintendent, and he was in charge of the spying operation of the McDonald's hired spies that infiltrated the group. He stated from the witness box that McDonald's security department were, quote, all ex-policemen. And he also said that if he ever wanted to know information about protesters, he would go to his contacts in the police. No doubt the inquiry will want to get to the bottom of the full level of this collusion. Helen and I sued the Metropolitan Police for passing on personal information about us to McDonald's. In July 2000, we received £10,000 compensation and a consent order in which the police committed, quote, to bring this settlement to the attention of the 3 area commanders of the Metropolitan Police Force and ask them to remind their officers of their responsibility not to disclose information on the police national computer to a third party. In 2005, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in our favour that there had been violations of the Convention's Article 6, right to a fair hearing, and Article 10, freedom of expression. Despite the damning rulings against McDonald's, it seems no police investigation, undercover or otherwise, or legal action was ever taken against them as a result. It is shocking that the police were instead targeting those exposing the truth about powerful, greedy and unethical corporations. Now my note 4, sorry, just if I can find it. Yes, the 1977 McLibel Trial judgment of Justice Bell set out in detail the continuous industrial scale of criminality by the McDonald's Corporation throughout the UK in the 1990s, especially in relation to employment laws and its suppliers' animal welfare laws. Yet the SDS targeted the campaigners who exposed these truths, not the organisation responsible for that criminality. The McDonald's Corporation could accurately be described as being subversive of the societal norms regarding employment, advertising, nutrition and animal welfare. Now, the background context to all this that I've set out in my statement, it has been explicitly supported by 90 of the core participants in this case. So I'll try to distinguish between those paragraphs and my notes, which are entirely my own. In 1968, following huge demonstrations in London's Grosvenor Square against the widely condemned Vietnam War, British police set up a special demonstrations squad to monitor and undermine such street protests. Since that time, over 1,000 groups campaigning in the UK for a better society, a better world, have been systematically spied upon, infiltrated, or otherwise targeted by secret and unaccountable political police units. This targeting has included over 140 highly paid police spies, living long-term as so-called activists, engaging in the everyday activities of groups and campaigns for equality and justice, for environmental protection, for community and trade union empowerment, and for international solidarity, for rights for women, rights for Black and ethnic minorities, workers, LGBTQ people, and for animals, and also targeting those campaigning against war, racism, sexism, corporate power, legal repression, and police oppression and brutality. Such groups and movements have comprised many millions of people throughout the UK who want to make the world better, fairer, and more sustainable for everyone. Thanks to their efforts, many of the ideas spread by such groups have now become mainstream opinion, and some campaigns and rights sought eventually resulted in legal and other formal recognition by society. Yet it appears that almost any group that stood up to make a positive difference in questioning or challenging the establishment has been or could have potentially been considered a legitimate target by the UK's secret political policing units. Any claims that the UK police are a non-political institution are therefore clearly incorrect. And my own notes, in addition to that, in paragraphs 24 of the opening statement by the counsel to the inquiry, he himself describes how at the very beginning of the formation of the SDS UCO HN 330 fulfilled the needs of Special Branch and MI5 for details about certain Labour Party members, protesters against apartheid South Africa and racist Rhodesia, and full details of the signatories to petitions on these issues. This is blatant subversion of everyone's civil rights and pretty much sets the scene for the next 50 years of these units. Back to my own text, collectively agreed text. These secret policing activities went far beyond investigating what was said in meetings. Individuals within or associated with those campaign groups, most of which had an open membership and active involvement based on trust and cooperation, were subjected to intrusions into their personal lives. Thousands of fake so-called friendships were developed, exploited and abused by secret police who continuously lied for their own political ends. Many people, especially women, were deceived into intimate and abusive relationships. Children have been fathered then abandoned, and the identities of deceased children stolen to provide cover names. Police spies took part in and actively influenced groups and activities, and there have been very many arrests and victims of miscarriages of justice as a result. Family campaigns, people seeking justice for loved ones killed by police, were deliberately undermined by these units. To bug a phone is recognised as a controversial breach of someone's human rights, and so police have to apply for a warrant to a judge. We're generally opposed to bugging with people's phones, and we note the public outrage over the phone hacking scandal a few years ago. However, to hack people's lives is infinitely worse and should be totally unacceptable to everyone by any standards. Much of the state response to public anger over these tactics has to present the spying and abuses that came with it as an aberration, a mistake, or the fault of rogue officers. We disagree. Based on the evidence, this spying was established and conducted from the very beginning with the full sanction of the state and supported by its apparatus and taxpayer funding. As stated by the women deceived into a relationship with the police spy, it was not just a single undercover officer, policeman in her bed, but also all those who put the officer in the field and supported them there. No decision about this all this was taken in isolation. The government, senior managers and the handlers may have tried to turn a blind eye to the abuses, or some of them, or deemed them politically necessary, but the reality is they were complicit in all of it. They readily accepted the intelligence provided, they funded, tasked and oversaw the spy cops units, and they set the agenda and ethos according to which these units operated. And we know that MI5 was dominant in this whole process. Sorry, that was my aside. Going back to my official text, this had nothing to do with responding to genuine public concern over any real and imminent serious violent threats to public safety and lives. The groups represented in this inquiry were not terrorist organisations, but were groups pushing for positive social change in an overwhelmingly public and open way. By targeting these groups, the police were demonstrating unacceptable and ongoing institutional discrimination, institutional racism, institutional sexism, institutional anti-democratic action, including industrial scale breaches of laws and charters that protect basic human rights and the right to protest. I want to add a note by note 8. Both society and the law both recognise that political activity, often along with religious activity, is entitled to extra protection. For example, in my own case, the European Court of Human Rights stated, quote, in their judgment, the central issue which fell to be determined was whether the interference with the applicant's freedom of expression had been, quote, necessary in a democratic society, unquote. The government had contended that, as applicants were not journalists, they should not attract the high level of protection afforded to the press under Article 10. However, in a democratic society, even small and informal campaign groups, such as London Greenpeace, had to be able to carry on their activities effectively. There existed a strong public interest in enabling such groups and individuals outside the mainstream to contribute to the public debate by disseminating information and ideas on matters of general public interest such as health and the environment. And the implication I draw from that is not only that campaigning groups should have additional protection in the right to continue their activities without harassment or indeed infiltration or targeting by undercover policing. Back to my statement. Over 100 of the inquiry's core participants summed up the problem here in a previous collective statement on the 17th of October 2017. Quote, for us, this inquiry is about political policing to undermine groups and organisations campaigning for a better society and world, unquote. This police bias was clearly sanctioned at the highest level. We know of no effort to show balance by police infiltration or secret targeting of powerful establishment bodies to investigate their crimes and their threats to social peace and society. Such organisations not targeted include greedy and unethical financial corporations, tax-avoiding hedge funds, military elites and their development of weapons of mass destruction, and power-mad establishment political parties. This is despite their continuous and widespread promotion of systematic institutional violence, such as wars, poverty, exploitation of workers, colonialism, and environmental destruction, and discrimination on the grounds of race, sex, and class, reinforced by public relations and manipulation of society for these institutions' own power and profit. I go to my note number 9. A lot of random words have been retrospectively conjured up by some state CP lawyers to try to justify the controversial secret political policing operations. Almost none of the target groups can be said to actively promote violence, with the exception of fascist groups who seem to hardly feature in the targeting. However, it has been said that some people associated with some targeted groups may have been sometimes not opposed to occasional violence or criminality or disorder, or have been, quote, extremists or subversive or even totalitarian. In my view, most religions and governments are, or potentially are, extremist and totalitarian unless restrained by a strong and assertive civil society. All governments support mass state violence, for example, wars and weapons of mass destruction, and police violence to impose their laws and ensure the maintenance of the capitalist status quo. And its attendant injustices and oppressions. MI5 seems to have dominated the SDS and NPOIU objectives by seeking information about and the undermining of groups and movements which are deemed to support subversion of the state. But instead, they should look elsewhere. For the last 30 years, Mass subversion of the state, supported by successive governments, has been systematically and continuously carried out by unaccountable multinational corporations seeking deregulation of laws protecting society from unrestrained profiteering, and taking over formerly nationalised industries and sectors so that a tiny few can profit from what were once state-run public services. Adding insult to injury is the deliberate widespread use of tax havens and other so-called loopholes to annually avoid billions of pounds of taxes due to the state, which could have been used for our struggling public services. Millions of people have suffered as a result. But has there been any undercover targeting of this serious industrial scale daily subversion of the state? I guess never. Those opposing this decades-long public scandal and subversion of the state, as many, if not most of the target groups have done, cannot themselves credibly be characterized as subversive of the state. In any case, I would suggest that the consensus in society is in large part that the state and police should be protecting society, not themselves, but they should be protecting society and not employing undercover political units with the aim of subverting civil society and the many progressive political and social movements who seek to protect and improve our society for all. My note continues. What is extremism? The most extreme challenge we all face and probably have ever faced is the climate catastrophe being caused by governments and corporations promoting unbridled resource extraction and consumerism based on fossil fuel extraction. In 1968, the American Petroleum Institute published a report on the consequences of burning fossil fuels, which found could lead to the melting of ice caps, rising seas, and potentially serious environmental damage worldwide. They said, quote, "There seems to be no doubt that the potential damage to our environment could be severe," unquote. That was 50 years ago, at the very time the SDS was being set up. Was the oil industry ever targeted by the SDS? If not, why not? Finally, in this note, earlier this year, the government recognised that concerted mass direct action protests about this issue weren't to be labelled extremist. There had been uproar over police counter-terrorism documents, including details about a range of left-wing and progressive campaigning groups. The groups targeted included Extinction Rebellion, following their civil disobedience efforts to blockade a number of London streets and sites for days at a time to bring attention to the climate crisis. The official response of the government in Security Minister Brandon Lewis MP to questions about these controversial police documents raised in Parliament, as reported on the 22nd of January 2020, stated, quote, "I want to reiterate that Extinction Rebellion is in no way considered an extremist group under the 2015 definition of extremism, and the Home Secretary has been clear on this point." Following the exposure of this undercover policing scandal, so this is back to my main narrative, following the exposure of this undercover policing scandal in 2010, it took 5 years of investigation, publicity and campaigning by victims and survivors of police infiltration, reinforced by police whistleblowers, and a couple of journalists indeed, for the government to decide to act. Even then, it took the shocking revelations that the family and surviving victim and close friend of murdered black teenager Stephen Lawrence had themselves been targeted by undercover policing. In July 2015, following widespread public outrage, the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, tasked the current undercover policing public inquiry with getting to the truth about this scandal and who authorised it, and recommending action to prevent future police wrongdoing. Since then, we have had to suffer 5 more years of police delays and obstruction. These tactics have resulted in a refusal to release most of the names of the 1,000 organisations spied and reported on, refusal to release the names and photos of most of the police spies, and refusal to release most of the relevant documentation generated by political policing units. Throughout these 5 years, we and other core participants, despite an imbalance in resources and almost zero access to the documentation held by the police for decades, have worked hard to get the information and justice that we and the wider public are entitled to. We have worked hard and remain determined to bring the whole murky secret policing, political policing operation and its unethical, unacceptable practices into the public spotlight where it belongs. This is supposed to be a public inquiry, but it seems often more like a police damage limitation exercise or cover-up. The hearings are not yet publicly accessible, apart from these opening statements, and nor will they be live streamed, unlike these opening statements, which is the only way to ensure that the millions of members and supporters of the targeted groups and movements have the opportunity to follow the proceedings as they happen. Like other non-state core participants, I urge you to reconsider the live streaming of all the evidence in these proceedings. There's still time to review that. We call for the inquiry to recommend that police units targeting campaigners seeking a better society should never have been set up and should be disbanded in their entirety. Note 10 of my notes adds, it's revealing to note that the women who had been married to undercover officers say in their opening statement that they were, quote, horrified that the Metropolitan Police Service, possibly through undercover officer Bob Lambert, who was then head of that unit, of the undercover units, had given the wrong impression to them that their husbands' targets were, quote, violent criminals and not the protesters, campaigners or political groups who were in fact being infiltrated and who, quote, posed no threats to the UCOs or their families. And former undercover officer Peter Francis also states, I quote, I now think that no undercover police officers should be targeting political campaigners, it being, quote, wholly unjustified. We call for full transparency and release of all the names of the groups targeted, all the names of the police spies, well, at least their cover names, and the full political files police have amassed on such campaign groups. Only in a spirit of openness and transparency can the grievous police crimes of the past be acknowledged, those responsible at all levels be held accountable, and the many victims start to move forward with the answers they have consistently called for and are entitled to. When the SDS was formed, they aimed to undermine the movements they were spying on. But despite the disgusting police tactics employed, movements for positive change to benefit the public good are still here and growing and have had many successes on the way. Such movements are needed more than ever in order to address the cumulative and deepening crises into which humanity is being plunged by the current system and its policies. A better world is possible, and it's up to all of us, whoever we are, to ensure support for and not the undermining of such movements for positive change. In conclusion, I support the recommendations taken from the People's Inquiry organised by the non-state core participants in July 2018 in Conway Hall, London. These include, in summary, full disclosure of the names of the spies the organisations they targeted, and the files compiled by political policing units, including Special Branch. A finding of institutional sexism, racism, and an anti-working class, anti-democratic agenda in the police, and a requirement to address it effectively. A recommendation that undercover political policing of protests and campaigning groups ceases and all such existing units are disbanded. Finally, as raised by the statement by Michael Mansfield QC, regarding the human intelligence, sorry, this is my own personal additional note, regarding the covert human intelligence sources bill currently being rushed through Parliament, the British government must clearly be very concerned, as indeed are the public, about the revelations coming out of this inquiry, and is therefore moving at spectacular pace to try to sideline, undermine, and I'm sorry to say, sabotage it. Instead of, as they clearly should be, respecting and considering the inquiry's content, progress, and recommendations, the government is showing its contempt of due process and the contributions being made in good faith by those contributing, even by those whose contributions we may not agree with. In the light of that, the matters we are discussing can clearly no longer be dismissed as merely historical. This gives even more reason for any independent public inquiry to not be intimidated or discouraged from making the necessary recommendations to address the concerns which have been raised, which clearly will be more important than ever in future. Thank you very much.